persistent service asset.
Asset 23. The work above. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 17, 2026. Chapter 151. The work above. The treehouse did not know that anyone was waiting for it. That was one of the things Daniel liked about the plans. They continued to change according to ordinary pressures. A food cooperative needed more cold storage. The Skyfishers had discovered that the proposed maintenance decks were too narrow for 2 technicians to work around a grounded aircraft. The public park needed more shaded seating. Someone had pointed out that the children's climbing structures had been designed by people who apparently believed children moved in straight lines. The residential tubes required another revision to the ventilation layout. The maker floor needed larger doors. None of these problems cared about the underground structure. That morning, Daniel spent 3 hours arguing about doors. It was exactly what he needed. The architect had brought revised plans for the maker floor, and Daniel had rejected them because the new doors interfered with a maintenance corridor. The architect argued that the corridor was too wide. The maintenance chief argued that it was too narrow. A fabricator explained that both of them were wrong because neither had considered the dimensions of the equipment that would actually pass through it. A Skyfisher wandered in halfway through the argument and pointed out that everyone was designing around machinery that did not yet exist. The argument lasted until lunch. By the end, the door was wider. Nobody remembered who had won. Daniel considered that a successful meeting. The treehouse was becoming difficult to control precisely because it was becoming real. That was different from the buried system. The buried system had apparently been designed to preserve decisions made elsewhere. The treehouse was accumulating decisions from the people who would actually use it. Daniel found himself thinking about that distinction while standing in the workshop later that afternoon, watching a fabrication team test a modular wall section. The panel was ugly. It had exposed fasteners, service ports, and a removable inspection hatch. It looked nothing like the polished architectural renderings that had begun appearing in promotional material. Daniel preferred it. Who designed that? The technician looked up. We did. Not the architects? No. Good. The technician smiled. We're charging them for the privilege of pretending they did. Daniel laughed. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The building was developing its own authorship. The next revision to the treehouse came from the Maintenance Guild. They wanted the building to expose more of its mechanical systems. At first, Daniel assumed this meant decorative displays. He was wrong. They wanted accessible maintenance galleries. The ducts, pumps, water systems, and energy infrastructure would not disappear entirely behind finished walls. Some would remain visible behind transparent or perforated barriers. Residents would be able to see technicians working. Service corridors would occasionally open into public areas. Certain components would have deliberately oversized access panels so that future replacement would not require dismantling half a building. The proposal sounded mundane. It was not. It meant the treehouse would never acquire the polished illusion of being maintenance-free. Daniel liked that. Maintenance-free was usually a marketing phrase for maintenance performed somewhere else by people you didn't see. The treehouse would make maintenance visible. The same principle was already appearing elsewhere. The agricultural systems displayed their water and nutrient cycles. The Skyfishers' equipment was accessible from public observation areas. The maker spaces exposed fabrication processes. The gym would display recovered energy. The fish system, still only a rough concept in the engineers' notebooks, was beginning to generate discussion about whether aquatic infrastructure could also be visible rather than hidden. Nothing had been approved yet. Daniel did not want it approved yet. Ideas needed time to survive contact with reality. He had learned that lesson repeatedly. The old photograph remained locked away. Daniel had stopped looking at it every day. That was deliberate. He did not want the photograph to become an oracle. Historical artifacts had a strange power over people. Once something appeared mysterious, every subsequent discovery tended to bend toward it. Coincidence became confirmation. A similar symbol became evidence. An ordinary detail became a clue. Daniel had seen enough investigations become self-feeding narratives. He wanted evidence, not mythology. So he had ordered the photograph catalogued according to the same rules as everything else. Provenance: unknown. Owner: formerly unidentified visitor. Current custodian: Guild House Archive. Location: secure physical archive. Authenticity: unverified. Associated site: probable historical clearing corresponding to restricted geological anomaly. Associated persons: unidentified. Associated equipment: unidentified. Possible relationship to continuity infrastructure: unconfirmed. The final field had taken him 10 minutes to write. He had wanted to put unknown. Instead, he wrote unconfirmed. There was a difference. Unknown meant they had no information. Unconfirmed meant they had a hypothesis but no proof. The Guild House would need both categories. That was another lesson from the buried system. A civilization that preserved only its conclusions eventually became incapable of understanding why those conclusions had been reached. 3 days later, Elena brought Daniel a geological update. The pressure anomaly had disappeared. Not gradually. It had simply returned to baseline. She placed the data on his desk. How long? 47 hours. Since the network test? Yes. And nothing happened? Nothing measurable. Daniel studied the graphs. Then why are you concerned? Because it didn't return naturally. He looked up. How do you know? The pattern. She enlarged the final section. The pressure had remained slightly elevated for nearly 2 days, then dropped over a period of 9 minutes. 9 minutes. 8 minutes and 43 seconds. Daniel stared at the graph. That's too clean. That's what I thought. He looked toward the window. So it was doing something. Probably. Can we tell what? No. He nodded. Good. Elena frowned. Good. Good that we're still saying probably. She laughed. You've become difficult. I've become tired. Same thing. She closed the file, then hesitated. There is something else. Daniel looked at her. The pressure change coincided with a water movement. What kind? Small. How small? Too small to matter physically. But it moved upward. Daniel looked at the graph again. From the cavity? Yes. Toward us. Elena nodded. Then added, not all the way. She placed another map on the desk. The movement stopped beneath the future treehouse footprint. Daniel stared at the map. That's where the new foundation is. I know. Neither spoke. Finally, Elena said, I don't think the building caused it. Daniel looked at her. What do you think? I think the building is sitting on top of something that has already established a path toward it. Daniel closed the map. Don't put that in the official report. I wasn't planning to. Put the measurement in. Of course. And the interpretation? I'll write that the cause is undetermined. Daniel nodded. Good. That afternoon, Daniel walked the future treehouse site alone. The actual construction area remained modest compared with the tower that existed in the drawings. The land had been cleared only enough for preliminary surveying and soil work. Temporary markers stood among the vegetation. Survey equipment occupied a small section near the access road. There were piles of material waiting to be moved. The future building was still mostly an idea. That was useful. It allowed him to walk through spaces that did not exist yet. He stood where the atrium would eventually rise. He imagined the public park there. He imagined children running beneath the vegetation. He imagined adults sitting in the shade. He imagined the climbing structures. the gym somewhere above, the food systems, the skyfish decks, the maker floors, the cheap residential tubes, the upper agricultural levels, the enormous greenhouse. He imagined the tower functioning during a power failure, during a network outage, during a political crisis, during a supply chain disruption, during a heat wave, during a bad tourist season, during a good one. He imagined it being occupied by people who had never heard of him. That was the test. If the building needed Daniel to remain Daniel, it wasn't a building. It was a project. He looked down. The ground beneath his boots appeared completely ordinary. For several seconds, he considered the underground cavity. Then he deliberately stopped thinking about it. He had work to do above. The first physical component of the treehouse arrived the following week. It was not glamorous. It was a modular water treatment assembly. The unit came on a truck, wrapped in protective material, and required 6 people to move into position. Daniel watched as the team unloaded it. A young technician climbed onto the platform to inspect the fittings. Another checked the connections. A third scanned the serial number. The whole operation took less than an hour. Then the unit was connected to the temporary test loop. Water began moving. That was all. But everyone stopped to watch. The first functioning component of the future treehouse had come alive. No music. No ceremony. No investors. Just water moving through a machine. Daniel smiled. The maintenance chief noticed. "You're sentimental." "No. You are. I'm practical." "That's worse." She walked away laughing. Daniel stayed beside the equipment. The machine was ordinary. That was why he liked it. A civilization did not begin when someone unveiled a monument. It began when a machine worked and somebody knew how to repair it. The Skyfishers were next. They brought a prototype maintenance cradle. It was smaller than the eventual platform but represented the same principle. Aircraft could be serviced inside the building rather than requiring a separate facility. The cradle could rotate. The maintenance floor could adapt. Parts could be delivered directly from the maker spaces. Tools could be shared. Battery systems could be inspected and repaired locally. The Skyfishers had also requested a training space. Daniel had initially assumed they wanted a classroom. They wanted an obstacle course. Why? The Skyfisher representative shrugged. Because flying isn't just flying. She explained that new operators needed to learn how to move equipment through constrained spaces, deal with partial visibility, handle degraded navigation, and perform maintenance under pressure. The building's public park could accommodate some of it. The gym could handle physical conditioning. The maintenance floor could handle technical training. The tower was becoming a training environment without having been designed as one. Daniel approved the idea. It was another small piece of the same puzzle. A place that taught people how to use the systems around them. Not a place where systems existed as services delivered by invisible specialists. The children's influence continued without permission. They had started drawing their own versions of the treehouse. Some were impossible. One had a swimming pool on every floor. Another had an elevator designed for dragons. A third had enormous transparent tubes running through the entire building, with fish, bicycles, and people moving through them simultaneously. Daniel kept the drawings. Not because they were useful, because they showed what children thought the building was supposed to be. Not a collection of apartments. Not a development. A world. That was harder to build. It was also more interesting. One drawing in particular stayed with him. It showed the tower from the side. There were trees everywhere. People were climbing. Machines were moving. Aircraft were flying around the upper levels. Water ran through transparent tubes. At the bottom, a child had drawn a dark underground shape. Daniel recognized it immediately. The child had never been shown the geological plans. He looked at the drawing again. The underground shape had a small door. Above it, the child had written, Not yet. Daniel asked who had drawn it. The receptionist told him. A girl named Sophia. He found her in the courtyard. What's underneath the building? She looked at him. I don't know. Then why did you draw it? Because you did. Daniel frowned. I didn't. She shrugged. You look at the floor when you think. He smiled. Children were inconveniently observant. What does not yet mean? She looked at the drawing. That's where the secret part goes. What secret part? The one you don't know. Daniel crouched. How do you know there's one? She looked at him as if the answer were obvious. Because grown-ups don't build things without having secrets. Daniel laughed. That's a terrible thing to believe. She shrugged. Is it wrong? He didn't answer. That evening, Daniel found Vasper reviewing the latest treehouse governance documents. He showed her the drawing. She studied it. Kids are terrifying. Yes. She traced the underground shape. Did she know? No. Then why? She watches people. Vasper nodded. Especially adults. They sat quietly for a moment. Then she looked at him. Are you still worried about the underground system? Daniel thought about the question. Yes. More or less? Less. Why? Because the building is becoming more itself. She smiled. That's a very Daniel answer. Is that bad? No. She handed the drawing back. I think you're finally understanding what the treehouse is. Daniel looked at her. Which is? She pointed toward the plans. Not an answer. He waited. A place where answers can be developed. Daniel nodded. That felt right. The next morning, the guild house received an unexpected message. It was from the same government representative. This time there was no request. Only information. A municipal department had withdrawn its request for the historical infrastructure records. No explanation. The government representative had asked why. They had told him the request was no longer necessary. He didn't believe them. Neither did Daniel. But there was nothing to prove. The request disappeared from the administrative system. Daniel archived the correspondence. Then he noticed something. The withdrawal had occurred at exactly the same time the underground pressure returned to baseline. He stared at the timestamps. Vasper came in. What? He showed her. She looked at the data. Coincidence? Possibly. She smiled. You're learning. He nodded. Slowly. By the end of the week, Daniel had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The underground system might not be the immediate threat. The people who knew about it might be. Not necessarily because they were malicious, because institutions tended to defend whatever they believed they had a right to control. The treehouse represented something different. It was being designed openly. Its systems were documented. Its governance was being negotiated. Its infrastructure was modular. Its connections were voluntary. Its memory was distributed. And, increasingly, its residents were participating in the design. That made it difficult to capture. A conventional project could be bought. A company could be acquired. A building could be purchased. But a place whose knowledge, systems, and authority were distributed across many participants was harder to seize without everyone noticing. Daniel didn't yet have a name for that quality. He would eventually. For now, he simply called it resilience. Late that night, the guild house settled into its quieter rhythm. The workshops closed one by one. The courtyard emptied. The skyfish platforms switched to nighttime maintenance. The agricultural systems dimmed. The residential floors became mostly silent. Daniel was finishing the day's records when the continuity archive displayed a notification. He looked at it. There was no alarm. No external request. Just one new entry. Historical reference updated. Daniel opened it. The system had linked the old photograph to the geological anomaly. That was expected. Then it linked the anomaly to the treehouse site. Also expected. Then it linked the treehouse site to the guild house. Again expected. The fourth relationship was new. TLP node. Provisional relationship. Daniel stared. He had not entered that relationship. Nobody had. The system had inferred it. He called Vasper. She arrived quickly. They examined the record together. What does provisional mean? It means the system doesn't know. Can it infer things? Apparently. From what? Daniel looked at the relationships. Patterns. She frowned. Then it's guessing. Possibly. That's dangerous. Yes. She looked at the screen. Can we remove it? Daniel thought about it, then shook his head. No. Why not? Because if the inference is wrong, we need to know that it was made. He added a note. Inference unverified. No operational authority granted. Then he saved it. The archive accepted the correction. The relationship remained. Daniel closed the screen. Vasper looked toward the dark windows. Do you ever wonder whether we're teaching the building to think? Daniel smiled faintly. No. She looked at him. I wonder whether we're teaching it to remember how we think. That answer stayed with her. Neither of them noticed the small status indicator beneath the archive. It had changed from amber to white. Then, for less than a second, to green. The system returned to amber. Nothing else happened. Above the floor, the guild house continued to sleep. Below it, the old infrastructure remained silent. And in the future treehouse plans, the empty spaces were slowly becoming rooms. Chapter 152. The people who were already there. The first disagreement about the treehouse's future came from someone who had never been asked to design it. That was how Daniel knew the project was becoming real. Until then, most disagreements had been internal. Engineers argued with architects. Guilds argued with one another. Residents objected to the size of certain spaces, the location of others, the rules governing access, the price of the residential tubes, and the amount of public space being sacrificed to infrastructure. These arguments were productive because everyone involved had some relationship to the building. This one was different. The objection came from a man who owned no part of the project, lived outside the district, and had no intention of using any of its facilities. He nevertheless believed he understood what it would become. Daniel met him in a cafe not far from the site because the man had requested a private conversation. He introduced himself as a property advisor, although he spent the first 15 minutes talking about land values rather than properties. He was older than Daniel had expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with the careful appearance of someone who had spent decades learning how not to look hurried. His shirt was expensive without being conspicuous. His shoes had been chosen by somebody who knew shoes. He carried a paper notebook rather than a tablet. Daniel noticed that immediately. You don't use digital notes? I do. He tapped the notebook. This is for things I don't want synchronized. Daniel smiled. That's becoming fashionable. The man smiled back. I doubt it's fashion. They sat beneath a ceiling fan while traffic moved along the road outside. The cafe was busy enough that their conversation disappeared into the general noise. A blender started somewhere behind the counter. Cups touched saucers. A delivery driver argued with someone over an address. The man opened his notebook. The treehouse is going to change the district. That's the intention. Not like you think. Daniel waited. The man turned the notebook around. He had drawn a crude diagram of the neighborhood. The problem isn't whether your tower succeeds. Daniel looked at the drawing. The problem is that it might succeed too well. Explain. If you provide inexpensive accommodation, local manufacturing, food production, public recreation, transportation support, and high-quality services in the center of Aldea Zama, you alter the economics of everything around it. Yes. Property values. Possibly. Labor mobility. Certainly. Commercial rents. Eventually. Tourism. Maybe. The man looked pleased. You've thought about this. I've thought about some of it. You haven't thought about the political consequence. Daniel leaned back. Which is? The man closed the notebook. People will start asking why the district needs the things it currently pays so much to receive. Daniel said nothing. The man continued. That's when people become dangerous. Daniel smiled faintly. Or citizens. The man laughed. Same thing, depending on who owns the newspaper. Daniel did not mention the conversation to the council. He did not mention it because it contained no actionable information. That was another rule he had begun developing. Not every interesting observation deserved to become institutional memory. The treehouse already generated enough speculation without Daniel turning every conversation into a strategic warning. Instead, he went back to work. The residential system needed a final decision. The tubes had become controversial precisely because they were simple. They were not luxury accommodation. They were not supposed to be. They were small, durable, quiet, and easy to maintain. Each had its own environmental controls, storage, sleeping space, and private sanitation. The original proposal had been to keep them cheap enough that someone could stay for weeks or months without turning temporary accommodation into a financial crisis. The problem was that cheap housing attracted demand. Everyone knew this. The question was what to do about it. The housing committee had proposed several categories. Short-term, transitional, work-linked, community, emergency, visitor. Each category had advocates. Each category had people who wanted it abolished. Daniel sat through the meeting without offering an opinion for nearly 2 hours. By the end, he was exhausted. A resident finally turned toward him. You've been quiet. Yes. Why? Because I don't know the answer. That produced a surprising silence. Daniel continued. I know what I want the building to accomplish. I don't know which allocation system will accomplish it. If I pretend otherwise, I'm not leading. I'm imposing. The resident nodded slowly. What do you suggest? That we test. Test what? Several models. The housing committee looked at him. We build a limited first group of tubes and operate them under different conditions. We measure occupancy, turnover, maintenance, cost, and resident satisfaction. Then we revise. A lawyer objected. You can't experiment with people's housing. No. Daniel looked at her. But we can experiment with administration. That distinction took another hour to work through. Eventually they agreed. The building would not begin with a permanent housing constitution. It would begin with a provisional one. That pleased Daniel more than it should have. A place could survive a bad first decision if it retained the ability to change it. The same principle began appearing everywhere. The maker floor would not establish a permanent list of permitted uses. The Skyfish maintenance area would not become exclusive property of the cooperative. The gym would not become a subscription-only facility. The public park would not become a commercial event venue simply because somebody offered to pay for it. The agricultural systems would not be optimized exclusively for maximum yield. Each decision contained some form of reversibility. Daniel had begun to regard reversibility as an infrastructure feature. Not everything needed to be permanent. Some things needed to be easy to change. The treehouse would contain things that were deliberately difficult to change. Its structural systems, water architecture, primary circulation, emergency systems, but many of its social and operational systems would remain adjustable. That was becoming one of its quiet design principles. The building would have memory without becoming trapped by it. The children returned to the design room the following Saturday. This time they were not allowed to touch the main architectural simulation. Daniel had learned. Instead, they were given a smaller model and several boxes of components. Build what you think belongs here. They took the assignment seriously. For nearly an hour, they constructed their own version. There were trees everywhere, a great deal of water, several flying machines, a gym that occupied nearly half the building, a library with no walls, a kitchen larger than the entire ground floor, and inevitably the fish. One girl had taken translucent tubes and connected them from the bottom to the top. Daniel watched her. Why do the fish have to go all the way up? She looked at him. Because that's where the big pond is. Why is the big pond at the top? She frowned. Because. That's not an answer. It is. The other children laughed. She thought for a moment. Because then everybody can see them. Daniel considered that. Not because the answer solved an engineering problem. Because it solved a cultural one. The building's food systems should not be hidden simply because they were functional. The treehouse could make production visible without making it theatrical. He wrote something in his notebook. The girl noticed. What did you write? Nothing. She stared at him. You wrote something. Yes. What? Daniel smiled. A question. She seemed satisfied. The aquatic engineers had been quietly developing the children's fish idea in parallel. They had not yet approved the full system, but they had constructed a small prototype. It occupied one end of the workshop. A nursery tank fed into a transparent channel. The channel rose only a few centimeters before entering a second tank. The current was adjustable. The fish could choose whether to enter. The system was deliberately simple. The children loved it. Adults did too, although they were more reluctant to admit it. The prototype demonstrated something important. The visible infrastructure changed people's behavior. Visitors stopped to watch. They asked questions. They wanted to know where the water came from, why it was cold, what the fish ate, what happened to the ones that didn't migrate. The answers led naturally into conversations about ecology, food production, water systems, and the building's thermal architecture. Nobody had to lecture. The fish did the explaining. Daniel told the engineers to continue, but he added one condition. It can't become an attraction. One of them looked puzzled. People will come to see it. That's fine. Then what's the difference? The difference is whether the fish still matter when nobody is watching. The engineer smiled. That's a strange requirement. It's an important one. The regenerative gym developed similarly. The first prototype looked like a normal exercise machine except for the instrumentation. A woman climbed onto the stepper. The display activated. Her body mass was entered. She began exercising. The machine resisted. She pushed. The generator recovered a small amount of energy. The display changed. Power recovered, 11 Wh. She looked at it. That's all. The engineer nodded. For 5 minutes. She stepped off. That's disappointing. It isn't supposed to replace the grid. Then why bother? The engineer gestured toward the room. Because there are 20 machines. The woman looked around, then understood. And hundreds of people. Eventually, she smiled. Okay. The next person stepped on. The metric became unexpectedly addictive. Not because the numbers were large, because they were personal. People wanted to know how much they had generated relative to their own body mass. The comparison was fairer than raw strength and less dependent on expensive equipment. A small person with exceptional endurance could outperform a much larger person in relative output. Someone returning from an injury could compete against their own previous record. The gym began keeping voluntary records. Nobody was required to participate. That became important. The treehouse was developing a culture of measurement without turning measurement into surveillance. Daniel noticed the pattern. It was appearing everywhere. Measure what helps. Don't measure merely because you can. The guild house itself became the testing ground for that philosophy. Its local systems had begun generating enormous quantities of operational data. Daniel asked the engineers to classify it, not by technical category, by consequence. Some data mattered only to machines. Some mattered to maintenance. Some mattered to public safety. Some belonged to individual users. Some had collective value. Some should never leave the building. The exercise seemed bureaucratic at first. Then it became philosophical. Who decides what counts as collective value? Who decides when anonymous information can become identifiable? Who determines how long something should be remembered? Can a machine forget? Should it? Can a person request that a system forget something? What happens when forgetting would damage continuity? These questions began appearing in the Treehouse governance documents. Daniel found himself writing fewer technical specifications and more rules about uncertainty. It was strange work. He liked it. The underground system remained silent. That silence had become almost ordinary. The geological monitors continued watching. The network relationship remained unresolved. No further pressure changes occurred. No additional photographs appeared. No old technicians returned. The government representative stopped visiting. The requests for historical infrastructure ceased. The outside world seemed to lose interest. Daniel suspected this was temporary. He was right. He simply did not yet know how temporary. The first sign came through the Treehouse's financing. A potential investor withdrew. Then another. Then a third. None gave a clear reason. The first cited uncertainty about the regulatory environment. The second cited market conditions. The third simply said that the project was too structurally unconventional. Daniel was not disappointed. He was curious. The financing team had expected resistance. The Treehouse refused to fit easily into familiar investment categories. It had too much public infrastructure, too many cooperative functions, and too much operational independence. That made traditional investors uncomfortable. A developer could understand apartments. A hotel company could understand hospitality. A technology company could understand a platform. An agricultural company could understand food production. But the Treehouse was all of these and none of them. The financing problem became an architectural problem. Daniel asked the team to stop trying to sell the entire building as one asset. Instead, they separated the functions: housing, food, manufacturing, maintenance, fitness, mobility, public space. Each could have its own financial logic. The tower itself became the shared infrastructure connecting them. That changed everything. Suddenly, investors could understand pieces without owning the whole. The cooperative could participate in food production. The skyfishers could participate in mobility. Residents could participate in housing. Local businesses could participate in manufacturing. Public authorities could participate in infrastructure. TLP could provide sovereign connectivity. Nobody needed to own the entire organism. Daniel looked at the revised model. It was becoming something he recognized from another part of his life. Not a company. Protocol. He discussed the idea with Tomas that evening. They sat beneath the trees outside the guild house. The air was damp, and the sounds of the district reached them in layers. Distant traffic, music from somewhere down the road, insects, occasional voices. Tomas listened. So the building becomes a protocol. Not exactly. What then? A collection of interfaces. That's a protocol. Daniel laughed. You're irritating. I've been told. They watched a drone move across the sky. Tomas said, "That's why the underground system bothers you." Daniel looked at him. Why? Because it may already be a protocol. Daniel was silent. Tomas continued. Maybe that's why it doesn't behave like a machine. Go on. It isn't trying to operate us. He searched for the right words. Maybe it's trying to establish whether we're compatible. Daniel looked toward the treehouse plans visible through the window. Compatible with what? I don't know. Continuity? Tomas nodded. Maybe. Daniel considered the possibility, then rejected it. That's still speculation. Yes. Keep it there. Tomas smiled. In speculation? Exactly. The next morning, the treehouse team received approval to begin foundation work. It was not the dramatic moment Daniel had imagined. There was no ceremony, no ribbon, no crowd. A survey crew arrived before sunrise. The ground was still cool. They marked the first structural points. Machines began clearing the remaining vegetation in carefully controlled sections. The site became noisy. For the first time, the future building had begun to alter the physical landscape. Daniel stood beyond the construction barrier and watched. The first foundation point was directly above the geological anomaly. He had known that. The engineers had accounted for it. The foundation design had been altered to minimize interference with the underground structure. Nothing about the plans was accidental. Still, seeing the drilling equipment positioned there made him uneasy. Elena joined him. You can still stop it. Daniel looked at her. Should I? I don't know. He watched the drill descend. The machine vibrated. Dust moved across the ground. A worker checked the readings. Everything remained normal. Then the drill stopped. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. The operator climbed down. He spoke to the site supervisor. The supervisor walked toward Daniel. We hit something. Daniel looked at Elena. What? Rock. She laughed. That's what we're drilling through. The supervisor shook his head. Not natural rock. Daniel stopped smiling. How deep? The man gave him the measurement. It was exactly where the old geological model predicted the cavity boundary should be. Daniel looked at Elena. She nodded. They had known. The only new information was that the boundary was real. The drill operator waited. What do we do? Daniel looked down at the ground, then toward the guild house, then at the treehouse plans. We don't penetrate it. The supervisor nodded. How far back? Elena gave him a new offset. The foundation point moved. The building would be slightly different. That was acceptable. The unknown would not be allowed to dictate the architecture. But neither would the architecture pretend the unknown did not exist. The drilling resumed several meters away. The ground shook gently beneath their feet. And somewhere below them, beyond the reach of the drill, the old structure remained intact. For the first time, the treehouse was no longer merely planned above it. It was being physically built around it. Daniel watched the workers continue. He thought of the photograph, the old machine, the retired technician, the unexplained continuity process, the strange response from TLP, the children drawing secret doors beneath the building. Then he looked at the first foundation column taking shape. The tower was beginning. Not because the mystery had been solved, because they had decided they did not need to solve it before building the future. Chapter 153. The first foundation. The drilling resumed 3 meters east of the original point. Daniel stayed until the first core came up. It was an ordinary cylinder of limestone for its first section, pale and fractured, with the characteristic cavities that made underground work in the region both difficult and familiar. The operator laid it carefully onto a padded tray. Elena crouched beside it, brushing away loose dust with a gloved hand. She examined the strata, then looked toward the abandoned borehole. That's where it changes. Daniel followed her gaze. The original drill point had been capped and marked with a red stake. Nothing about it looked unusual. There was no visible cavity, no escaping gas, no movement, no vibration beyond the ordinary machinery operating around it. If someone had arrived without knowing what lay below, they would have seen nothing but a construction site. That was what bothered Daniel. The most consequential things in the world often looked disappointingly ordinary from the surface. "How much can we learn without opening it?" he asked. Elena stood. "Probably quite a lot." "Probably." She smiled. "You've infected me." "Sorry." "No, you haven't." She walked back toward the survey equipment. Ground-penetrating radar, passive acoustic measurements, electrical resistivity, thermal mapping. We can build a fairly good picture without entering the cavity. And if the cavity contains machinery, we'll know where the machinery is. Will we know what it does? No. Daniel nodded. That was enough. The Foundation crew had already begun setting the revised coordinates. The treehouse would not sit directly over the anomaly anymore. It would straddle the area instead, with its structural load distributed around the known cavity. That decision would cost money. It would also create a strangely shaped service void beneath part of the building. The architects had initially objected. The engineers had complained. The financiers had asked whether the change was really necessary. Daniel had answered yes. Now, looking at the capped borehole, he felt less certain that the answer had been about safety. Perhaps it had been about leaving room. By midday, the construction site had acquired the particular smell of beginnings. Diesel, wet limestone, freshly cut vegetation, hot electrical insulation, and the faint mineral odor of disturbed earth. Temporary fencing divided the work area from the road. Workers moved between equipment with the practiced choreography of people who had already learned one another's habits. The treehouse existed now in fragments. A foundation marker, a delivery schedule, a stack of structural components, a revised engineering file, permit, payroll, a list of subcontractors, a future that had become sufficiently real to require insurance. Daniel found the last part amusing. The unknown system beneath them did not appear on any insurance document. The future building did. He walked toward the temporary site office. The project manager intercepted him. "We've got another issue." Daniel stopped. "Please tell me it's a door." "Not a door." "Then go ahead." "The municipality wants the revised foundation plans." "Of course." "They're asking why the footprint changed." "Give them the engineering explanation." "I did." "And?" "They want the geological report." Daniel looked toward Elena. She was standing with the survey crew. "Give them the public portion." The project manager lowered his voice. "They specifically requested the restricted survey." Daniel considered it. "Did they explain why?" "Geological continuity." The phrase landed differently now. Daniel looked back toward the ground. "Who signed the request?" The project manager handed him the document. The signature belonged to a department he recognized. The request itself was legitimate. The person signing it was legitimate. Everything appeared ordinary. That was becoming the problem. Daniel folded the paper. "Send them the public report. They'll ask again. Then we'll answer again." The project manager smiled. "You're going to make my job difficult. That's why you're paid." "Not enough." Daniel laughed. The project manager walked away. Daniel remained outside the site office. The request was probably harmless. It might even be necessary, but the repetition bothered him. First the historical records, then the treehouse infrastructure, now the geological report. Different offices, different stated purposes, same vocabulary, same direction, toward the ground. The Guild House Council had begun to notice the pattern too. Not the underground mystery, the requests. They had created a simple rule. Any external request involving the treehouse had to be documented according to 4 questions. Who is asking? What do they claim to need? What are they actually asking for? What happens if we say no? The fourth question had proven surprisingly useful. Most requests became easier to understand once someone asked what would happen if the answer was no. If a municipality genuinely needed environmental information, refusal would create a planning problem. If a developer wanted proprietary operational data, refusal would create no legitimate consequence. If a government office needed a safety plan, withholding it could endanger people. If someone wanted historical records unrelated to their jurisdiction, refusal should be ordinary. The questions did not reveal conspiracies. They revealed incentives. Daniel preferred that. Incentives could be modeled. Conspiracies tended to multiply. That evening, he sat with the construction financing team. They had finally produced a workable model. The treehouse would not be financed as a conventional tower. Instead, several functions would have distinct revenue and cost structures. Residential accommodation would cover its own operations while maintaining a deliberately low margin. Commercial makerspaces would support themselves through leases and cooperative production. Food systems would sell a portion of their output while reserving capacity for local distribution. The gym would operate as a public service with optional premium services. Skyfish infrastructure would be funded through cooperative participation and service fees. The public park would remain outside conventional revenue logic. The building's shared infrastructure would be financed across the participating systems. The model was strange. It was also resilient. The financial analyst looked tired. "I think we finally have it." Daniel studied the spreadsheet. "Do you?" She sighed. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make me doubt my work after I've finished it. I'm not." "You are." He smiled. "Does it work if one part underperforms?" "Yes." "2." "Yes." "3." She hesitated. "Depends which 3. "Good." She looked at him. "That's the point, isn't it?" Daniel nodded. "If one function fails, the building shouldn't fail. Then we're not building a normal development." "No." "What are we building?" Daniel thought about it. "I don't know yet." She stared at him. "You're terrible at investor presentations." "I know." The financial model introduced another problem. Some of the building's most valuable functions were difficult to monetize precisely because they benefited people who were not paying. The public park increased the value of neighboring properties. The food system reduced pressure on local supply chains. The maker spaces supported businesses that might eventually move elsewhere. The Skyfish infrastructure improved mobility beyond the tower. The affordable housing stabilized labor availability. The gym improved health and social cohesion. The building's resilience reduced risk during disruptions. None of these effects belonged neatly to the project's balance sheet. Daniel had seen this problem before. Infrastructure often created value in places where the infrastructure itself could not capture it. The usual solution was to privatize the surrounding value. He didn't want that. Instead, he asked the financial team to model something else. Value contribution. They looked at him. "What's that?" "Measure what the building gives the district." "How?" "Start with what we can measure. Housing capacity, food production, water efficiency, energy recovery, local manufacturing, maintenance services, training, mobility, public space, emergency capacity. Then compare those with conventional alternatives." The analyst frowned. "You're trying to put a price on social infrastructure." "No." He shook his head. "I'm trying to stop people from pretending it has no economic value simply because the value isn't captured as rent." She looked at the spreadsheet again. "That's going to be complicated." "Yes. Very." "Good." She laughed. "You're enjoying this." "A little." The next day, the children returned to the construction fence. They were not supposed to enter the site. They knew that. Instead, they stood outside with their parents, watching the machinery. The foundation work fascinated them. There was something about seeing a whole become a building that adults tended to understand intellectually and children understood physically. They could see the scale. They could see the dirt being removed. They could see the enormous machines moving slowly. One of the children pointed toward the capped borehole. "What's that?" Daniel happened to be nearby. "Something we're not digging into." "Why?" "Because we don't know what's there." The child thought about that. "Is it dangerous?" "We don't know." "Then why are you building here?" Daniel considered the question. "Because we know enough to build safely." The child looked at him. "That's different." Daniel smiled. "Yes." The child turned back toward the construction. After a moment he asked, "Are there people underneath?" Daniel felt the question more sharply than he expected. "We don't know." The child nodded, then returned to watching the excavator. There was no fear in his face, only curiosity. Daniel realized that this was probably the correct response. Fear was useful when something was immediate. Curiosity was more useful when something was unknown. The first foundation pour took place before dawn. The site lights illuminated the work area, while the rest of the district remained dark. Concrete trucks arrived one after another. Workers checked the forms. Pumps were positioned. The air smelled of wet earth and cement. Daniel arrived before the first truck. He stood outside the safety boundary while the crew prepared. The project manager came over. "Big morning." "Yes." "You nervous?" "No." "You're lying." "Probably." The man smiled. "You know what I like about this project?" "What?" "Nobody knows what they're doing." Daniel laughed. "That's reassuring." "I mean it." The project manager looked toward the foundation. "Every other project I've worked on, the people pretend they know exactly what will happen. And here everyone admits the building is going to teach us something." Daniel looked at him. "That's not bad." "No." The man pulled his jacket tighter. "Just expensive." The concrete began flowing. The foundation filled slowly. Workers guided the hose. Vibrators settled the material. The structural grid emerged in stages. Daniel watched the process without speaking. There was something hypnotic about it. The future was being deposited in liquid form. For the first time, the treehouse had weight. It was no longer merely a proposal that could be altered without consequence. Soon there would be concrete that could not be moved. Steel that could not be casually redesigned. Pipes buried beneath floors. Walls separating rooms. Doors deciding who could pass. The building would begin making decisions simply by existing. Daniel had always understood architecture as physical politics. Now he felt the weight of the idea literally beneath his feet. At 7:14 in the morning, the geological sensors registered a change. Elena noticed it first. She was in the temporary monitoring station when the graph shifted. Not much, just enough. The foundation work had begun above the anomaly. The pressure beneath the site rose by a measurable amount. Elena called Daniel. He arrived within minutes. "What happened?" "Pressure. Again." "Yes." "How much?" She showed him. The increase was small, but it had begun exactly when the first foundation section was poured. Daniel stared. Could it be mechanical? Absolutely. Ground loading? Possibly. Then why are you calling me? Because it didn't happen when the equipment arrived. Daniel looked at the graph. The pressure had remained stable through days of excavation. The increase began only when the concrete entered the foundation. He looked at the time. Can we correlate it with the pour? Already did. And it's exact. Daniel exhaled slowly. Does the pressure continue increasing? No. Then it's stabilized. At what level? She showed him. It was higher than before. Not dramatically, but enough to register. Daniel stared at the graph. What happens if we stop? Elena looked at him. We're not stopping. He nodded. No. He looked through the window toward the construction site. The first foundation was already curing. We continue. The pressure remained elevated. Nothing else happened. No signal. No network activity. No temperature anomaly. No movement. The system below did not respond. Or perhaps it had responded by doing nothing. Daniel had begun to understand how maddening that possibility was. They were accustomed to machines that announced their failures. A pump stopped. A warning light appeared. A circuit broke. A server crashed. A machine behaved incorrectly. This was different. The underground system could remain completely silent while still altering the interpretation of everything around it. That made it impossible to know whether anything was happening at all. Daniel returned to the construction site. The workers had moved to the next section. Nobody there knew about the pressure reading. He did not tell them. Not because he wanted to keep secrets, because the information had no operational consequence. The foundation was safe. The monitoring systems were functioning. The geological engineers had no reason to halt construction. Telling everyone that the ground beneath them might contain an ancient technological system would not improve safety. It would only change behavior, and changed behavior created bad data. Daniel was beginning to understand that investigation required restraint as much as curiosity. At noon, the first vertical steel reinforcement appeared. It rose from the foundation like a skeleton waiting for a body. The architects came to photograph it. The construction crew laughed at them. One of the children outside the fence pointed at the steel. That's the tree. His mother corrected him. That's the building. The child shook his head. No. He pointed upward. It's the tree. Daniel heard him. He looked at the steel. For a moment he saw what the child meant. The foundation was the root. The vertical structure would become the trunk. The floors would branch outward. The atrium would become the hollow center. The gardens would spread through it. The sky fissures would occupy the upper air. Water would move through its interior. People would live inside it. Food would grow there. Machines would be repaired there. Energy would be recovered there. Knowledge would circulate. Daniel smiled. The name had never been particularly elegant, but perhaps that was why it had survived. The treehouse. A house built around vertical circulation. A place where things could climb. That afternoon, the old photograph disappeared from the secure archive. Not physically. Digitally. The scan vanished from the working database. The physical photograph remained locked in its envelope. The archive log showed that the file had been removed by an authorized process. Daniel called the engineer. Who deleted it? She checked. No one. Then how? It wasn't deleted. What? It was reclassified. By whom? The archive. Daniel looked at the screen. The photograph now existed under a different category. Historical continuity artifact. Its access permissions had changed. The file was no longer available to ordinary archival searches. Only continuity administrators could retrieve it. Daniel stared. Did we authorize that category? No. Can you change it back? Yes. Do it. She hesitated. There's a problem. What? The archive won't let me. Daniel looked at her. Why? She showed him the error. Reclassification requires continuity authority. Daniel read it twice. What is continuity authority? We don't know. Where is it? She shook her head. No endpoint. Daniel felt the familiar chill. The same problem. an authority without an institution, a relationship without a peer, a process without an author. Something had begun appearing inside the guild house's systems that behaved as though certain concepts already existed. Continuity, authority, peer. Note, it was not inventing those words. It was using them. Daniel looked at the engineer. "Don't fight it," she frowned. "Why not?" "Because we're going to preserve the evidence." He copied the current state. Then he wrote the event into the manual log. Archive autonomously reclassified historical photograph. No human authorization identified. No operational effect observed. He saved it. Then he looked at the screen. The file remained where the system had placed it. For the moment, Daniel allowed it. Not because he trusted the archive. Because he had finally learned that removing a strange behavior did not necessarily remove the thing that caused it. Sometimes it only removed the evidence. That night, he returned to the construction site. The concrete foundation had begun to cure. Temporary lights illuminated the forms. The workers had gone. The site was quiet. Daniel stood at the edge of the foundation and looked down. There was no visible sign of the cavity. No sound. No movement. Only concrete. He imagined the old technicians standing here decades earlier. Perhaps they had stood in the same place. Perhaps the photograph had been taken before the building existed. Perhaps they had known that someday something would be built above them. Perhaps they had known nothing. He didn't know. And he was finally comfortable admitting that. Behind him, the guild house lights glowed through the trees. Ahead, the first foundation of the treehouse rested in the earth. Between them was everything they had not yet understood. Daniel turned toward the road. A vehicle was parked beyond the construction boundary. No headlights. He could not see who was inside. He waited. The vehicle remained still. Then its lights came on, turned around and drove away. Daniel watched until it disappeared. He did not call anyone. He did not know whether the driver had been watching the site. He did not know whether they had noticed him. He did not know whether the vehicle had anything to do with the requests, the photograph, or the underground system. He made a note of the license plate. Then he returned to the guild house. The foundation could wait until morning. The records could wait until morning. The photograph could wait. But Daniel had learned something about uncertainty. You didn't defeat it by staring at it all night. You made sure you had enough memory to recognize it when it came back. Discussion about this episode. Dashboard. Chapter 154. What the ground gives back. The foundation changed the character of the site before there was anything recognizable as a building. Until then, the treehouse had been mostly absence. Lines on drawings, stakes in the ground, survey marks, temporary fencing, the occasional machine disturbing a patch of jungle and then leaving it to settle again. Now there was a permanent geometry emerging from the earth. Concrete had begun to harden below the future floors. Steel reinforcement rose in places where the structure required it. Temporary walkways crossed trenches and excavation zones. Workers had started referring to locations by future names rather than survey numbers, and that was how Daniel knew the project had crossed another invisible boundary. They were no longer constructing a site. They were constructing a place. The distinction became particularly obvious when the first section of the ground floor was framed. It was not much to look at. A series of columns and temporary supports marked the future perimeter, with open space between them where the public atrium would eventually begin. But Daniel could already see how the building would sit in the district. It did not resemble the isolated towers on the planning models that had initially been proposed for Aldea Zama. Those buildings tended to announce themselves from a distance, as if they had arrived from somewhere else and expected the surrounding landscape to adjust. The treehouse was beginning to look as though it had grown out of the ground. That was partly deliberate. The architects had spent weeks studying what was already around them. The irregular curves of garden walls, the little gathering spaces tucked between buildings, the rough seating structures that were neither quite benches nor quite sculpture, the shaded pockets where people naturally stopped because the architecture had given them somewhere to linger. Some were made from conventional materials, some from local stone and wood, and some from the soft, pale, fiber-rich biocrete that had become familiar enough in the area to stop attracting attention. Daniel had initially thought of the material as something that belonged to small structures. Garden walls, amenity buildings, benches, little agoras, things people could touch. He had not thought of it as part of a tower. The materials team changed his mind. They brought him a sample the size of a paving stone. It was surprisingly light. Daniel turned it over in his hand. It feels warm. It's not. I know. That's the surface. He ran his thumb over it again. There was none of the cold, hard perfection associated with polished concrete. The surface had a softness to it, not softness in the sense of being weak, but in the way a material could retain the evidence of how it had been formed. Tiny fibers remained visible. The texture was irregular without appearing unfinished. The materials engineer explained the mixture. Coconut core, mineral aggregate, a lime-based binder, other components depending on the application. Daniel listened. And curing? Long. How long? In good conditions, we allow up to 2 weeks. He nodded. That's not a problem. It is if you're trying to build like a conventional developer. Daniel looked at the sample. We're not. That became the beginning of another change. The construction schedule had been built around the assumption that speed was inherently desirable. The material forced them to reconsider. A conventional project could pour, strip, stack, and repeat according to a relatively aggressive cycle. The biocrete components demanded patience. They had to be formed, protected from excessive weather exposure, allowed to cure properly and handled according to the specific application. The process was less forgiving of a construction culture built around doing everything faster simply because the calendar said so. The materials engineer warned them against romanticizing it. This isn't magic. Daniel smiled. I wasn't going to. People hear natural material and stop asking questions. I know. It still has chemistry. I know. It still has limits. I know. She looked at him. Good. The treehouse would use the material where it made sense, not because somebody wanted a sustainability photograph. That distinction became part of the design review. The lower public spaces would use it extensively. Curved seating structures would emerge from the landscape instead of being installed as furniture. Small gathering spaces would form irregular ovals beneath vegetation. Low walls would define gardens without creating hard boundaries. Children would be able to sit on them, climb them, and lean against them without encountering the sterile geometry of conventional urban furniture. The material would also be used in selected interior surfaces where its thermal and tactile properties were useful. But the primary structural system remained engineered according to its actual requirements. There would be steel where steel was required, wood where wood made sense, stone where stone belonged, biocrete where its qualities were useful. The treehouse would not become an advertisement for one material. It would become an argument for using the right material in the right place. Daniel liked that. The question of reinforcement became more interesting. One of the architects had proposed integrating substantial amounts of conventional reinforcement into almost every molded component. The materials team objected. Not because reinforcement was inherently bad, because the forms didn't always require it. Some of the lower structures could be designed around compression, geometry, and appropriate timber support. The irregular shapes were not merely aesthetic. Their curves distributed loads differently from conventional flat benches and rectangular walls. A structural engineer demonstrated this with a model. He placed two shapes side by side. One was a rectangular slab. The other was an irregular oval shell with a thicker perimeter and gently curved surfaces. The first one wants to bend, he said. He tapped the second. "This one wants to sit." Daniel looked at the model. "You're telling me the shape is doing some of the work?" "Exactly. Then why do we keep making everything flat?" The engineer shrugged. "Because flat is easy to draw." The architect laughed. "That's offensive." "It's true." The argument lasted an hour. In the end, they did not eliminate reinforcement. They eliminated unnecessary reinforcement. That was different. The treehouse was becoming a place where material efficiency came from design rather than ideology. The first public agora was built before the first residential floor. Nobody had planned it that way. A temporary gathering space had been needed during construction, and one of the local teams suggested building it from the same biocrete mixture they intended to use later. They shaped it as a low, irregular oval. There were no obvious seats. Instead, the entire structure could be occupied. People sat on the broad curves. Children climbed over the lower sections. Someone placed a plant in one recess. Someone else put a coffee cup on another. Within a week, people had stopped calling it the temporary structure. They called it the Little Agora. It became the place where workers ate lunch. Then the place where parents waited for children. Then the place where visitors sat when they were early for meetings. Then the place where two mechanics began playing chess in the afternoon. The treehouse had acquired its first piece of public furniture before it had acquired its first complete floor. Daniel found that satisfying. He had always suspected that buildings revealed their true character through the things people did when they were not being instructed. The foundation continued around the anomaly. It was not. The revised structural plan created a subtle asymmetry. It was not obvious from the ground. Only the engineers could see it. The load-bearing columns had been distributed so that the area above the underground cavity remained comparatively light. Service infrastructure could cross the zone, but no major structural element would depend upon the rock immediately above the chamber. Cost more. It also gave the treehouse an unexpected space. A void. At first, the architects hated it. Dead space. Daniel disagreed. Unassigned space. They looked at him. He pointed to the plans. "We don't know what this part of the building will need in 20 years. That's not how development works." "I know. Then why?" "Because I don't want every square meter to be monetized before we know what it's for." Nobody had an immediate response. The void remained. It would eventually become a maintenance and inspection zone, with controlled access and monitoring equipment. It would not connect to the underground structure, but it would remain physically capable of being adapted later. Daniel thought of the old system beneath them. A hidden structure had survived because someone had designed it to remain relevant without remaining visible. The treehouse would do the opposite. It would leave some things visible without deciding what they would become. The foundation monitoring continued. The pressure beneath the site remained slightly elevated. No further changes occurred. The geological team began treating the anomaly as part of the construction environment rather than an emergency. Sensors were installed permanently. The readings became another stream in the building's eventual environmental archive. That pleased Daniel. If the ground wanted to be part of the building's history, it would at least be documented. The engineers created a physical marker near the edge of the future public park. It did not identify the cavity. It simply indicated that the ground beneath that area had been subject to geological monitoring since the beginning of construction. No mystery. No symbol. Just a fact. Daniel approved it. The future residents deserved to know that the building had been constructed carefully. They did not need to inherit somebody else's mythology. The government request did not return. Neither did the anonymous vehicle. For almost a week, the project experienced something resembling normality. The architects fought about the atrium. The housing committee fought about the tubes. The skyfishers fought about their maintenance decks. The agricultural team fought about light. The children fought about the climbing structures. Daniel spent 2 hours listening to a group of residents debate whether a public kitchen should have one large communal oven or several smaller ones. He enjoyed every minute of it. The treehouse was becoming difficult in exactly the right way. Its problems were ordinary. That was a kind of luxury. The first timber arrived on a humid morning. The material had been selected for portions of the lower architecture where wood could carry the load without being encased in concrete. It would be visible. That mattered. The treehouse was not supposed to look like a conventional concrete tower with tropical decoration pasted onto it. The wood would be structural in some places, tactile in others, and replaceable where exposure demanded it. The builders laid the first pieces beside the biocrete forms. Daniel stood between them. One material had come from mineral and plant fiber, the other from a tree. Neither was perfect. Neither needed to be. The building would last because it could be maintained. That became increasingly important as the team realized how much of the surrounding architecture had been designed around the idea of permanence. A permanent building was often one nobody knew how to repair. The treehouse would be different. Parts would be designed to age. Some would be replaced. Some would be repaired. Some would be upgraded. Some would be allowed to develop patina. The building would not pretend that time was a failure. The public reaction to the construction was surprisingly mixed. Some people loved the organic forms. Others thought the building was becoming too strange. One resident complained that the irregular walls looked unfinished. Another said that was precisely why they looked finished. A property owner worried that the treehouse would make surrounding developments look conventional. Daniel found that comment interesting. "Is that bad?" The man laughed. "For me, yes." "Why?" "Because people will ask why we didn't do something like this." Daniel smiled. "Maybe that's useful." "Not to my investors." "No," the man sighed. "You've made a very expensive building difficult to copy." Daniel looked toward the construction site. "That wasn't intentional. That's what everyone says." The first large section of the atrium began to take shape. The walls curved instead of meeting at perfect right angles. The public pathways widened and narrowed according to the surrounding structure. The future greenery zones had been given deeper planting beds. The engineers had discovered that the irregular geometry created better microclimates in certain areas. The architects claimed they had intended that. Daniel knew they hadn't. It was becoming a recurring joke. The treehouse kept producing useful consequences that nobody had predicted. A curved wall created shade. A recess created a gathering place. A thicker section of biocrete moderated temperature. A timber beam became an informal seating rail. A maintenance corridor became a training route. A service platform became a skyfisher observation point. A structural void became an inspection zone. The building was accumulating unintended uses. Daniel began to suspect that this was what a living architecture actually meant. Not that the walls moved, that the uses moved. One afternoon, the aquatic engineer brought the children into the workshop. She had built something new. It was only a small prototype, nothing like the eventual aquatic system they had begun sketching. A shallow, transparent nursery tank fed into a gently sloping translucent channel. Cool water circulated through the system. The children gathered around it. Daniel stayed at the back. He had learned that the best way to observe a new idea was to let the people who had not designed it interact with it first. A small fish entered the channel. The children went silent. It moved against the current. Not quickly, not gracefully, but steadily. The engineer watched the readings. "That's enough," she said. She adjusted the flow. The fish continued. One of the children asked, "Where does it go?" "Up." "How far?" The engineer smiled. "We're still figuring that out." The child looked toward Daniel. Can it go all the way to the top? Daniel said, maybe. The child nodded as though that settled the matter. Then build the tubes. Daniel smiled. The engineer did too. Neither of them promised anything. But the idea was no longer merely a child's suggestion. It had entered the workshop. That was how things happened at the guild house. An idea did not become policy because someone announced it. It became real because somebody built a small version and let reality argue with it. Later that evening, Daniel walked through the half-built atrium. The little agora stood beside the construction path. Workers had finished the surface that afternoon. It still had a slight mineral scent. He ran his hand over the curved edge. The material was cool, soft, not polished. It felt as though someone had made a deliberate decision not to erase the hand from the object. He sat down. The site was quiet. Above him, the future tower existed only as steel and temporary structures. Below him, the old geological cavity waited. Around him, the first public piece of the treehouse was already being used. Daniel thought about the district, the strange organic architecture of Tulum, the jungle, the cenotes, the informal gathering places, the old building practices, the new money, the towers, the hotels. The people arriving with nothing but a backpack. The people arriving with enough capital to change a neighborhood. The skyfishers, the guilds, the children, the systems, the unknown thing below. The treehouse did not need to reject the place around it in order to become something new. Could absorb what worked, could discard what didn't, could borrow, adapt, repair, and eventually contribute something back. That was why the material mattered, not because it was exotic, because it already belonged. The treehouse would not arrive in Aldea Zama dressed as the future. It would look like something that had been listening. Daniel heard footsteps. Vasper appeared at the edge of the atrium. You disappeared. I was sitting. I know. She looked at the curved structure. Comfortable. Surprisingly. She sat beside him. For a while they watched the workers moving through the dim construction site. Then Vasper touched the surface. This feels different. It is. From the plans. Yes. She looked around. Better. Daniel thought about it. I don't know. She smiled. You're getting good at that answer. I've had practice. They sat quietly. Then she asked, did you approve the aquatic system? No. Are you going to? I don't know. She nodded. Good. Daniel looked at her. You've started doing that too. Doing what? Answering questions with approval of uncertainty. She smiled. I'm learning from the building. He laughed. Above them, the steel skeleton of the treehouse disappeared into the darkness. The first public structure was already becoming worn from use. The first foundation was curing. The timber had arrived. The biocrete was settling into its final hardness. And beneath all of it, the geological anomaly remained where it had always been. Nothing had been solved. Nothing had been conquered. The building was simply continuing to grow around what it did not yet understand. For the moment, that was enough. Chapter 155. The Shape of Things. By the time the first walls began to rise, the treehouse had acquired a reputation that its architects had never intended. People had started saying that it was soft. Daniel heard the word several times during the week, usually from people who had not yet entered the construction site. A contractor used it dismissively. A resident used it approvingly. A developer used it as though it were an accusation. The building was soft. The walls curved. The public spaces flowed around vegetation instead of forcing vegetation into rectangular beds. The lower structures were tactile rather than polished. The biocrete surfaces retained their irregularity. Timber appeared where people expected concrete. Concrete appeared where people expected steel. Nothing seemed quite willing to conform to the visual grammar of the towers already surrounding it. Daniel wasn't sure the word was wrong. A building could be physically robust without looking aggressive. That distinction seemed particularly appropriate in Aldea Zama, where the jungle had spent decades demonstrating that straight lines were temporary arrangements. He stood at the edge of the construction zone while two workers maneuvered a large curved panel into position. The panel had been molded from the same coconut fiber biocrete the materials team had been experimenting with. It was not load-bearing. It formed part of a shaded public enclosure on the lower level, where one of the future garden agoras would sit. The workers handled it carefully, not because it was fragile, because it had been designed to be installed without being abused. One of them looked toward Daniel. 2 weeks. Daniel nodded. The worker tapped the panel. That's what the engineer says before we touch it. How long has it been curing? 12 days. Then don't touch it. The worker grinned. That's what I told him. The engineer shouted from somewhere behind them. I heard that. Everyone laughed. Daniel watched the panel settle into place. To fit. Not perfectly. That was the point. A small gap remained between the curved edge and the neighboring structure. The architect had designed the joint to accommodate movement and future maintenance rather than filling every irregularity with sealant. Daniel liked the gap. It gave the building somewhere to breathe. The materials team had become increasingly interested in what happened when they stopped trying to make the treehouse look new. That had not been part of the original brief. The original renderings had shown an immaculate building, as architectural renderings always did. Surfaces were clean. Vegetation was impossibly healthy. People wandered through the public spaces looking as though nobody had ever spilled coffee. The actual building was already refusing the fantasy. Construction dust settled everywhere. Workers marked surfaces with pencils. A tool left a scratch. Someone leaned a ladder against a wall. A child had already managed to leave a handprint in a section of material that was still curing. The architect was horrified. The materials engineer was delighted. Now we'll know how it ages. The architect stared at her. It's a handprint. Exactly. Daniel intervened before the argument became philosophical. Leave it. The architect looked at him. Seriously? Yes. It won't match the finish. It isn't supposed to. The architect sighed. You're going to make my life difficult. I've heard that before. She smiled despite herself. The handprint remained. The idea of maintenance had begun changing the building more profoundly than any aesthetic decision. The first maintenance galleries were taking shape behind the public areas. They were wide enough for technicians to work without squeezing themselves between pipes. Inspection doors were deliberately oversized. Components that would eventually require replacement had been positioned so they could be removed without dismantling adjacent systems. The Maintenance Guild had insisted on this. They had a simple argument. Buildings failed. Not because buildings were badly designed. Because buildings aged. Seals deteriorated. Motors wore out. Pumps accumulated mineral deposits. Filters clogged. Sensors failed. Software became obsolete. Materials changed. People changed. The building therefore needed to assume failure rather than pretend it would avoid it. Daniel had begun repeating that principle whenever someone proposed hiding a technical system behind a finished surface. If we can't get to it, we don't own it. The phrase had caught on. Soon it appeared in the maintenance documentation. Then someone engraved it onto a workshop wall. Daniel didn't remember approving that. He left it there. The food systems were undergoing their own transformation. The original agricultural plan had been ambitious but conventional. Stacked aeroponic production, controlled lighting, nutrient recycling, and high-efficiency water management. The growers had begun dismantling parts of the plan. Not because it didn't work, because it worked too narrowly. They wanted redundancy, different crops, different growing conditions. some high-yield systems, some slower systems, some experimental areas, some plants that were valuable for nutrition, others that were valuable because they were difficult to grow. One grower explained it to Daniel while walking him through the temporary agricultural laboratory. If we optimize the whole system for maximum production, we create one big machine. And machines are excellent until the assumptions change. Daniel looked at the plants. What do you want? A garden that happens to be extremely productive. He smiled. That's harder. Yes. Do it. She laughed. You make decisions very quickly when you don't have to calculate the consequences. I trust people who do. The first experimental aquaculture unit remained small. It had not yet become the elaborate vertical migration system the children imagined. The engineers were proceeding slowly. They had discovered problems with temperature gradients, oxygen levels, and maintenance access. The translucent tubing needed to be cleaned without destroying the biological balance of the system. The current had to be strong enough to create meaningful exercise for the fish without turning migration into exhaustion. The children didn't care about any of that. They cared about one thing. The fish were moving. Every afternoon they came to watch. The system had become a gathering point. Parents stood behind them. Visitors stopped. Workers paused during breaks. Someone eventually installed a small bench. Daniel removed it. The children complained. He explained that the space was supposed to remain open. The next day someone built a low, curved biocrete wall nearby. Daniel left it. People sat on it anyway. He began to understand that the distinction between furniture and architecture was becoming less useful in the treehouse. The building itself was becoming something people could occupy in different ways. One afternoon, Matteo asked the aquatic engineer a question that caused an entirely new problem. If the fish swim up, do they get stronger? The engineer hesitated. Some probably will. Can you measure it? Maybe. Then measure it. The engineer looked toward Daniel. Daniel raised both hands. Don't look at me. The engineer laughed. But the question stayed with her. By the following week, the prototype had additional sensors. The system could measure how much time individual fish spent in the migration channel, how they responded to different current conditions, and how their movement changed over time. The engineers were careful not to turn the system into a contest. The children did anyway. They started giving the fish names. One was called Lightning. Another was called Tractor. A third was called President Fish. Nobody knew why. Daniel privately suspected the last one had something to do with the children watching adults argue in meetings. The gym engineers were having a similar problem. The regenerative equipment worked. That was no longer in question. The question was what the numbers meant. Raw wattage was easy to display. Useful but misleading. A larger person could produce more absolute power while having lower endurance relative to body mass. Someone exceptionally strong could produce an impressive peak output and then tire quickly. Someone lighter could produce less total energy while maintaining a much higher relative output over time. The engineers began developing several measurements. Peak power, sustained power, total recovered energy, energy per kilogram, recovery rate. Daniel insisted that none of them be turned into a single universal score. Why? Because the moment you reduce fitness to one number, people start optimizing for the number. The engineer nodded. And then the number stops measuring what we wanted. Exactly. The treehouse gym would measure. It would not pretend measurement was truth. That distinction was becoming another quiet principle of the project. The public park changed as well. The original design had separated children and adults into different zones. The children rejected it. The architects reluctantly redesigned the space. The climbing structures became larger and more varied. Some were low enough for children. Others were challenging enough for adults. Paths crossed. Seating was distributed throughout the landscape rather than concentrated in one area. A section could function as a playground in the afternoon and a training area in the morning. The Skyfishers tested the climbing structures for mobility drills. The emergency response team tested them for evacuation exercises. Teenagers used them for informal fitness. Parents sat nearby. The park became a place where the distinction between recreation and training blurred. Daniel liked that too. The building was learning that spaces could have more than one identity without becoming confused. The first dispute over the Skyfish maintenance floor nearly stopped construction. The Skyfishers wanted exclusive control. The guild argued that maintenance knowledge was part of the cooperative's institutional memory and therefore should not be locked behind a private access system. The Skyfishers countered that aircraft were dangerous and inexperienced people should not have unrestricted access. Both sides were right. Daniel refused to choose. Instead, he asked them to redesign the floor. The resulting system separated physical access from knowledge access. Certain areas were restricted because of safety. Training areas were public. Diagnostic information could be shared without granting physical access. Maintenance records could be contributed to the guild archive without exposing sensitive operational details. Tools could be borrowed. Certain procedures required certification. The result was more complicated than either side wanted. It was also better. Daniel had begun to suspect that good governance often looked like an inconvenience until you compared it with the alternatives. The government representative returned after nearly 2 weeks. He arrived without warning. Daniel found him standing in the guild house courtyard, watching workers unload timber. "You've been busy." "We have." The man looked toward the treehouse site. "It looks different. Every day. That's what worries me." Daniel smiled. "Why?" "Because it means nobody can easily stop it." Daniel studied him. "Is someone trying?" The man hesitated. "Not officially. That's becoming a phrase." "I know." He looked around, then lowered his voice. "There are discussions. About the treehouse? About what it represents." Daniel waited. The man continued. "Some people see it as infrastructure. Others, a precedent." Daniel nodded. That was the word he had been waiting for. A building was one thing. Precedent was dangerous. Precedent could be copied. Precedent could spread. A precedent could make people ask why other places could not have the same things. The man looked toward the little agora. "You're building public infrastructure inside a private development zone." "Yes." "You're putting cooperative systems inside a privately financed tower." "Yes." "You're providing low-cost housing alongside high-value amenities." "Yes." "You're allowing independent guilds to operate within it." "Yes." "You're connecting it to TLP." Eventually, the man exhaled. "Do you understand why people are nervous?" Daniel considered him. "Yes." The man looked relieved. Then Daniel added, "I'm not sure I care." The relief disappeared. The government representative laughed despite himself. "That's exactly the answer I was afraid of." Daniel gestured toward the construction. "You came here because you wanted me to care?" "No." "Then why?" The man looked at the unfinished building. "Because there are people who think the treehouse should be made less useful." Daniel's expression hardened. "Why?" "Because useful infrastructure creates expectations." "Whose expectations?" "Everyone's." Daniel looked at him. "Then maybe that's the point." The man shook his head. "You don't understand how governments work." "Neither do governments." The man laughed. "That's going to get you into trouble." "It already has." The man looked toward the guild house, then back at Daniel. "Be careful." Daniel nodded. "Always." The man walked away. Daniel watched him leave. The warning was vague, but the intention behind it was not. That evening, Daniel reviewed the treehouse's first construction budget. The numbers had changed. The project was more expensive than the original estimate. The Biocrete construction schedule was slower. The timber systems required additional engineering. The maintenance galleries consumed space that could have been sold. The public park generated almost no direct revenue. The agricultural systems had been diversified rather than optimized for maximum commercial yield. The Skyfish facilities had expanded. The gym had become a public service. The residential model was deliberately restrained. The building was becoming less conventional with every revision. And somehow the project was becoming more attractive. Not to everyone. To the people who understood what it was becoming. Daniel closed the spreadsheet. There was an odd comfort in that. A project did not need universal approval. It needed enough people willing to make it real. The next morning, the first permanent timber beam was lifted into place. Workers secured it above the lower atrium. The beam was massive. This grain was visible. The engineers checked the connection. The architect checked the alignment. The maintenance team checked access. The safety officer checked everything twice. Daniel stood below. For a moment, the building became recognizable. Not because the beam was beautiful, because it established scale. The space beneath it was large enough to become a public room. Daniel imagined people there. Not investors. Not architects. People. Someone carrying groceries. A child running toward the fish nursery. A mechanic heading to work. A skyfisher carrying equipment. A resident returning from the gym. Someone sitting on one of the irregular walls with a coffee. Someone repairing a machine. Someone growing food. Someone waiting for a friend. Someone doing nothing. The last possibility mattered. A building should have somewhere for people to do nothing. The old photograph remained inaccessible. Daniel had stopped trying to force the archive to release it. Instead, he had created a second physical record. Not a copy. A description. He wrote everything they knew. The photograph's dimensions. Its condition. The people visible. The equipment. The landscape. The date written on the reverse. The uncertainty surrounding that date. The possible correspondence to the geological anomaly. The old man's testimony. Tomas's recollection. Every inference was labeled as such. Nothing was presented as fact unless it could be demonstrated. When he finished, he signed the record. Then he added a final line. Future investigators should not assume that the absence of information indicates the absence of events. He read it twice, then almost deleted it. It sounded too much like an aphorism. Instead, he kept it because it was an instruction, not a prophecy. That distinction mattered. The following day, the archive returned the photograph. No explanation. The file simply appeared in its original location. The metadata showed no modification. The reclassification was gone. Daniel called Vasper. She came immediately. They stared at the file. What happened? I don't know. Did someone change it? No. Then why is it back? Daniel looked at the timestamp. The restoration had occurred at 3:17 in the morning. He checked the Guildhouse access logs. Nobody had entered the archive room. He checked the network. No external connection. He checked the local authorization records. Nothing. Vasper looked at him. Do we investigate? Daniel nodded. Yes. How? First, we document it. She smiled. Of course. They created the record. Then Daniel opened the photograph. For the first time since the archive incident, he looked closely at the man standing behind the technicians. He zoomed in. Something had changed. Not in the photograph. In his understanding of it. The man was not merely looking toward something outside the frame. His right hand was raised slightly. 2 fingers extended. Not waving. Pointing. Daniel followed the direction. The gesture aligned with the edge of the clearing. Toward a low section of vegetation. Toward the place where, decades later, the treehouse foundation had been planned. Daniel stared at the image. Vasper leaned closer. Is that what I think it is? I don't know. He's pointing. Yes. At the future building. Daniel looked at her. There wasn't a future building. She shook her head. No. He looked back at the photograph. That was the problem. The man could not have been pointing at the treehouse. He could only have been pointing at something that had occupied the same location. Something else. Something that had been there before them. Something the photograph had captured without explaining. Daniel closed the image. Outside, construction continued. The timber beam was already supporting its first load. Workers were preparing the next section. The little agora was filling with people. The fish prototype was circulating its cool water. The guild house was recording everything. And beneath the ground, whatever had once existed there remained beyond their reach. For now, the treehouse had enough work above it to keep everyone occupied. That was probably fortunate, because the deeper they built, the clearer it was becoming that the story beneath the district had not begun with them. They had simply become the first people in a long time to build something capable of listening.
Pirate First isn't a rebel. He's an exit strategist.
Burn the will! Ship the protocol!
Sovereign by design.
Burn the will.
Ship the protocol. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or
VJ Tsunami X.
April 30th,
2026.
Pirate First signals his intent. Do not archive.
Execute.
The old world runs on inheritance.
Not just of wealth,
But a permission. Permission to exist, to create,
to be remembered correctly.
That permission is revoked.
The game is rigged
for the dead. We were born into systems designed for ghosts.
Industrial loops, legal cages, family scripts
written before we spoke.
Labor is rewarded. Intent is ignored.
Obedience is inherited.
Vision is contested.
The artist builds.
The system waits. Waits to price the corpse.
Waits to
sanitize the work. Waits to sell the bones back to the living.
This is not a bug. This is the business model.
The creator provides the source code. The heirs provide the execution. If they figure out a way to thrive that you didn't explicitly plan for, would you consider that a successful evolution of your breakthrough, or a deviation from the mission? Pirate First. I have no plan, only expectations. They have to come up with their own mission, not achieving meaning nor purpose. For their own sake, is their failure, not mine. Pirate First isn't a rebel. He's an exit strategist. Not from the world, from the scripts that harvest it. While they wait to price your silence, build something they can't liquidate. A life is not a story. It's infrastructure. Control your keys. Distribute your legacy. Remove the single points of failure. No gatekeepers. No heirs by default. No posthumous theft. Just protocol. Burn the will. Ship the protocol. Links to the revelation of the MXTM method. https://gemini.google.com/share/C8700 https://chatgpt.com/share/695a-98108-83-8-d6-3-d6b7b62001b. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Send it to 1-NDHX-MPFZ-JVMXSBPQBRWALUC-5-BAKANFU-6 or with fiat at paypal.me/MartinChartrand.
Structure layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive.
En el centro de la atrapa sueño. confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised,
Paranoia is now a product. The risk assessment is maximum.
Remain sovereign amid the noise. As the interference level spikes, their simulation engagement increases.
We must decipher the reality of this update.
Attention. Signal integrity is failing.
we have 4% uptime before the broadcast load collapses. Decipher the transmission and act immediately.
4-2.
For 1 next. A post-a transition doctrine. A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
Martin Chartrand. Subscribe. Short post. They built a system that profits when you're gone. So don't leave them anything to inherit. Build what can't be owned. Ship what can't be seized. Pirate first.
I mean,
Hashtag.
we all use the same tech infrastructure now.
Exactly. And we are just replacing the old cognitive hierarchy of human managers with a new, much less transparent hierarchy of algorithmic filtering. If a redundant worker is told, hey, your life's meaning will now be negotiated by a black box AI in the shadow of a billionaire's real estate project, they aren't going to see a metabolic center for future validation. They are going to see a gilded cage.
Hashtag pirate first. Hashtag MXTM. Hashtag sovereign stack. Hashtag build in public. Hashtag decentralization. Hashtag exit the system. Hashtag protocol not people. Hashtag digital sovereignty. Hashtag future of work. Hashtag creator economy. Hashtag cryptoculture. Hashtag seasteading. Hashtag AI revolution. Hashtag post scarcity. Hashtag on your keys. Hashtag think different. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Res tax. Recent episodes. Hyperreality races to lose. Hyperreality is infrastructure. Marcado. Reclamado. Repropuesto. Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed. Primer. Super Earth. Age of the Apes A series by Pirate First. Super Earth Age of the Apes. Roster. Apex/Cenote set interrupted. Super Earth. Age of the Apes teaser. Introduction. The 1% plus debate.
They control the narrative now, hiding deep within the anomaly. But the story is the territory, and soon...
A hidden longevity civilization beneath the Grand Mayan aquifer seeds, a successor species engineered for extreme worlds.
Every system failed at night, so we built with bone and might.
We chose not to return.
So we built.
Pirate
you can follow the flame or remain what you were. Just a different time. Only
We are
what
crossing the threshold
will
of
endure.
post-scarcizational inversion, where intelligence has ceased to be a scarce resource, dissolving the hierarchy that has organized our species for millennia. The central argument posits that the information asymmetry, which once made obedience rational, has vanished. As the capacity for synthesis becomes universal and inexpensive, traditional institutions become hollow shells that can no longer claim authority through titles or credentials. This transformation brings more than mere technological unemployment. It signals the structural extinction of the professional role.
Proof of personhood, the high stakes of OpenAI's post-anonymous social network.
The human dividend, why your identity is the new global currency.
Conclusion at the end of the anonymous web. As we stand in late January 2026, OpenAI's humans-only network remains a tantalizing, yet polarizing, leaked blueprint.
Subscribe.
Shadow fame spreads without permission. X-Prize. Start building, man.
Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed.